funny things. Kids can be funny, right? And I have a few funny things that kids say, funny questions that kids ask in church that I just want to put it out there right off the top. And one of them, asked by a child, I don't know the age, but did God mean for the giraffe to look like that? Or was it an accident? Another one is, how come God hasn't invented any new animals lately? All we have are just the same old ones as before. So, that's a good question, right? You go to the zoo more than once, and you're like, well, where's the new animals? Right? It's just the same ones every time. Another one is, I went to this wedding, and they kissed right there in church. Is that okay? Well, when the pastor says to do it, then I guess it's okay. I don't know. Those are funny questions, but there's some serious questions, too, that kids ask. One is, who created God? It's a good one. Also, do I have to be nice to everyone? That's funny and serious, right? What about strangers, though? Do I have to love strangers? You told me not to talk to strangers. So that's a tough question. Also, what about kids who never hear about Jesus? Do they still go to heaven? That's tough. Those first few questions are fun to laugh at, and most of them are pretty easy to answer, right? We can engage a child on those things and have a little fun, and maybe even we can all learn something. Those last few questions are trickier, though, aren't they? Because kids may be rudimentary in their understanding of a lot of things, but they can still ask some very smart questions, and sometimes smarter than we were ever prepared for. So when we hear that second set of questions, our reflex might be to say something like, well, go ask your mother. Or go ask your father. In our house, it's go ask your father, right? He went to seminary, go ask him. Let him sweat through that one. Well, there was one time I definitely did sweat through a question. That was when Asher and Anya were 3 years old. I took them to the little playground on the seminary campus where we were living. And they were playing for a while, and then we spotted underneath the playground equipment was a dead bird. Now, Anya loves birds, especially Anya, loves birds. So I kind of didn't want them to see this, but they did, and there it was, and I was sweating a little bit, like, oh, there's going to be questions. What do I say? We haven't encountered this before. And then one of my professors walked out of her house, because most of the professors live right there on campus. And Sharon was her name. She walked out, and she is one of the most pastoral people, most pastoral professors, very loving, very caring and kind. And so I kind of deferred to her, and I'm like, oh, we're in this situation. Is there anything you'd like to say to my kids about, why is this bird dead or whatever? And I really wish I could remember what she said. But whatever it was, it helped, and they stayed calm. They didn't lose their minds like I was afraid they would do after seeing this. And I was kind of lucky that happened, because I was hoping they didn't see it at all. Because I didn't want the questions. I was just like, don't ask, right? I don't know if I can handle those questions. But these kids at this age, but kids always ask, don't they? Kids are not afraid to ask the questions that are on their minds, unless they've been traumatized, God forbid, for some reason. If there's a question, they're going to ask it. If you have a question for them, they're going to ask it honestly, right? There's no pretense there. And just a few months after that happened with the dead bird, George Floyd was murdered. And this was all, of course, we didn't watch the news with them, but there were posters everywhere. We were living in the D.C. area, and it was a very intense place to be for social upheaval, social issues and things like that. And so they would see people protesting, they would see these big posters, they'd hear people talking, and say, who is George Floyd? And we made a tough decision to go ahead and explain to them what had happened. And so it's like, hey, I know you're only 3, but let's talk about racism, and let's talk about murder, and let's talk about police, and all of these complicated issues. And as you can imagine, especially if you know my kids, that resulted in question after question for months and months. And we couldn't tell if they were really handling it well. And there were points where we started to regret having explained it to them. Like, were they too young? I don't know. But here we are, right? They weren't afraid to ask these questions. We were just afraid to handle them sometimes. So, are you ever afraid to ask a question? James touches on this in his letter. You notice where it says, you do not have because you do not ask. Now, when we read that, we tend to think about you don't have good things from God, because you don't ask. You ask for healing or you ask for a job or whatever. Then you would have it, but you don't ask, so you don't get. But we might be talking about a lot more than just getting things. I mean, have you ever had a question that's bothered you for months and months or for years and years, and you don't get that answer? Maybe because you're afraid to ask. And we see that in the gospel too. We see Jesus' disciples, when he's talking to them, he's giving them these hard truths. He's giving them like George Floyd style hard truths, that I'm going to be killed, I'm going to be murdered, and then 3 days later I'm going to rise again. And the gospel says they were afraid to ask him about this because, in my mind, they were afraid it might upset their assumptions about what's going on. They assumed they were cruising to victory. They assumed they were on their way to being vindicated. But what if Jesus is saying they're not about to be vindicated? They're about to be subjugated. They're about to be defeated. And they didn't want to be disabused of that notion of victory. So they're afraid to ask. They're afraid what the answer is going to be. I know I have resisted asking a question before because I was afraid of what the answer was going to be. But if you experience that fear, if you know what that's like, maybe you're afraid to ask a question because you've been burned before. You've asked that question that was honestly on your heart, that was burning, you were burning to know, so you opened your mouth and spoke it, and maybe you were shamed for even asking the question. Maybe you were told, just have faith. Stop asking so many questions. Stop doubting. And just have faith. Or maybe you were told, well, it's a mystery. And that was it. Mysteries are good. Mysteries are real. But it's a cop-out sometimes to say, well, it's a mystery. Let's not think too hard about that. Maybe you were shamed for asking a question. I hope no one ever is afraid to ask me a question. And I've tried to model that here at St. Michael's of this kind of openness, and that doubt is an important part of the journey of faith, and that questions are how we learn. And I hope that I've modeled that here. I hope that I've put that out there implicitly, but just in case I haven't, let me make it explicit. And I promise you right now that, and this is on video, so you can refer back to it if you have to. Promise. I will never make you feel bad for asking a question. And I will do everything I can to answer it. If it's my truth to give, then I will give it to you. And obviously there are situations where an answer might betray confidentiality, or it might be too personal, because we all have agency in that, in what we share from ourselves and from our own lives. But I promise you, I will always tell you exactly what I believe. And sometimes that answer is going to be, I don't know the answer to that. Let's work on that together. And we can go find some resources to explore that further. Or sometimes the answer is going to be, I am still working on that one. That was the question about Satan a few weeks ago. To be honest, that's a topic I am still working on. I have ideas, but it's not settled. And I'm going to be honest with you about that. So I hope that we always feel free to ask questions. And maybe your question isn't about God or theology or the Bible or Christianity. Maybe your question is about church life or your home life or your work. Or maybe you want to come to me and say you'd like to take on a new role in the church. Or maybe you'd like to let go of a role that you occupy. But you can be afraid to ask. I have those situations too. I had an encounter with a parishioner just the other day where I had never asked her to do anything before. And I wanted to get a few new people to contribute to our food for coffee hour. So I asked her if she would contribute once a month to coffee hour, even though I was a little nervous because I hadn't asked her for anything before, but I did it anyway. And she said no. But she did it so graciously. And she went out of her way to explain to me how she would like to, but this is because of circumstances. This is the reason why she needed to say no. And I just felt so respected in that encounter. And I'm in this moment thinking, this is the model. This is what we need to learn to do better. Don't be afraid to ask. And don't be afraid to say no. We can do it in a context of love and respect. And I don't think that's something we're culturally very good at. If we're not good at it here in this church, I think it's just because our culture is that way. It makes us a little afraid of each other, a little bit. We wonder if people are suspicious of us or they'll assume the wrong motives if we ask. But there are ways that we can get better at that, and I think one of those ways is to improve our relationships with each other. And that is where the positive affirmations come in. Again, we have plenty of visitors here this morning, which is amazing, and some of you might know exactly one name on that list, so that one person might get a few more affirmations in the end than the rest of us, but that's okay. Don't feel pressured whatsoever. Will you pick that up? Do what makes sense to you. Turn it in at the end if you can, or turn it in next week if you can, and we're going to distribute those. But so often we go through our week or go through our Sunday assuming that we know what people think of us. And we're afraid. Why would we be afraid to share love? Why would we be afraid to share a compliment? Or just share thanks and gratitude with each other and say, you know what, you brighten up my day every time I see you. We're afraid to say that for some reason. And I think we can unlearn that. We can grow out of that. And if that means doing it sort of privately, because you don't have to put your name to it. It is anonymous. But it's just one of many baby steps to improving our relationships with each other. So to finish off here, speaking of questions, you might even have some questions about the readings from this morning. And I hope you're not afraid to ask those, but just in case you have some, I'm going to do a little FAQ real quick at the end. Because one of the questions I have, frankly, about the reading is that Proverbs 31. Thank you, Trish, for reading that with a straight face. Appreciate it. That's a weird one, right? It's like what is it? Not a perfect wife, but a noble wife who can find, an elite wife. I don't know. Why are we still, it's 2024, why are we still getting up and reading things about what a perfect wife looks like? Aren't we kind of past that? You know, isn't that kind of antiquated? I'd say maybe we are past that. But instead of looking at it as a guideline for how God wants a woman to be, which is unreasonable no matter what your gender is, that list, nobody is measuring up to that. Maybe we should look at it as a love poem. It's a love letter to an ancient wife from an ancient husband that maybe would fit a little bit better in Song of Solomon than in Proverbs. And we can view it that way as just a sort of over-the-top Valentine from a guy he's just head over heels for his wife. And we could read it that way, and we can enter in and enjoy that sentiment without feeling like there's all this pressure, because people have done it. People have put pressure on women especially to measure up but I don't think we have to see it that way. That's my super short answer to that question. If we had one more question about the readings from this morning, it might be from the gospel, where Jesus says, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And don't strive to be first. You might ask me, Ryan, how can you get up there and call yourself our priest? Shouldn't you be striving to be last? And I struggle with that one, too. But we see Jesus himself did not shy away from leadership. He didn't shy away from teaching with authority, but he used that opportunity to show people a different model of leadership, a different way of being a leader. And that's the model that I try to keep in front of me at all times. A different way of doing it. And I hope that we can find a different way of being a community as well. Of people that are not afraid of each other. Of people who are safe and comfortable to be honest, both in their questions and their answers. And if you need a teacher to help you figure out how to do that, I recommend finding a little kid. Amen.